So let's talk about viruses now. Best microorganisms. And it's not an opinion, it's a fact. So remember, those are non-living things, okay? And all viruses, no exceptions, are obligate intracellular parasites. Which means not only that they must parasitize, means that they have to be inside of the cell, okay? Why is that so? All viruses do not have ribosomes, and all viruses don't have their own metabolism. And by metabolism, I mean energy conversion, energy generation. Okay? That makes sense? Good? So that's what I mean when I say, no metabolism. Structurally, viruses can be defined into two categories: naked and enveloped. So naked virus consists of a capsid and genome inside. Okay? Enveloped virus is like a bag with the headphones inside of the Amazon box. So you have your capsid, you have your genome, and outside you have an extra layer called envelope. This difference between the naked and enveloped viruses is really important because they have different sensitivity or resistance, whatever you want to call it, to cleaning agents. Does that make sense? They have different sensitivity to temperature changes like environment and stuff like that. Enveloped viruses are generally less stable. Like coronavirus is an enveloped virus. It doesn't survive on the surfaces that well. So all that hygienic theater that we observed in the beginning of the pandemic when people bleached their groceries was kind of stupid. That makes sense. So they were discovered in 1899 by Ivanovsky. It's not super important. What I wanted to highlight, they really small. So most viruses, you gotta have an electron microscope to see them. Okay? Good? This is why the first name for the viruses was filtrable agents, not viruses. Because when they were discovered, they were going through the special filter that would otherwise retain the bacteria. So they were smaller than bacteria. They were passing through the filter that was retaining bacteria. We clear? And this is why Ivanovsky called them filtrable agents. And then the name viruses stuck. So the virus that I wanted to use as an example here is papilloma virus. So human papilloma virus. Oh yeah, I never mentioned what genome is. And it's really cool. Because the genome of all living things is double-stranded DNA. Whether it's you or fish or bacteria. Well, viruses are not living. So the viral genome can be made out of double-stranded DNA, like papillomaviruses, single-stranded DNA like parvoviruses, the slapstick disease, double-stranded RNA like rotaviruses, or single-stranded RNA like coronaviruses. So they basically have no formal restriction here on the genome. Does that make sense to you? All right, so papillomaviruses. So papillomaviruses are naked with a double-stranded DNA genome. Now, before we figure out what kind of disease they cause, So papillomaviruses are really good at infecting epithelial cells. And here's your skin epithelium with multiple layers of cells, right? And the only layer that can actually divide, cells that can divide, is the basal layer, okay? So here you have your basal layer. The virus infects the cell in the basal layer. Of course, skin has to be kind of damaged, scratched a little bit. It can't just dig its way through, okay? So it infects the cell in the basal layer, and now he faces a conundrum. It's a double-stranded DNA virus. In order to divide, virus has to double its DNA. Make sense? It does not have the machinery to double the DNA. So it's got to use cellular machinery. So the task now is to force the cell to double its own DNA and kind of hitch a ride on the cellular DNA machinery. We clear? Most cells, wherever in the body, normally are in what's called quiescent state. They aren't going to divide now. So essentially, papillomaviruses force the cells in the basal layer of the epithelium to double the DNA. When cell doubles the DNA, it commits to division. You see what I'm saying? So virus enters and starts pushing cell into constant division cycle, into mitosis. And cell keeps on dividing so the virus can replicate. Good? So this cell keeps on dividing, pushing other layers up. Only that little tiny area. And what you get a wart. Skin wart. Okay? Now, you can imagine that division results in accumulation of mutations. And mutations, as we all know, may lead to development of cancer, malignancy, right? Well, good for us is that there is a system of special cellular sentinels, watchdogs, mostly P53. So for example, P53, which will kind of kill this malignant progression by killing the cell. So kind of, to reward this, think of it this way. Look. Cell keeps on dividing, right? Accumulates mutations due to the division. At some point, P53 protein detects the accumulation of those mutations and sends the cell into apoptosis. It dies, fine. Your wart does not grow to unlimited thickness or height. Does that make sense? So everything looks pretty hunky-dory, except for the fact that you have a wart, which can be removed surgically, not a big deal. Now, there are two subtypes of papillomaviruses, type 16 and 18, which will block this P53 system. And cell keeps dividing unchecked and eventually slides into the malignant phenotype. We're talking about cervical cancer, practically 100%, anal cancer, practically 100%, vulvar cancer, penile cancer, and there are some oropharyngeal cancers that are associated with HPV as well. Okay, specifically those two types. Good news, there's a vaccine. Called Gardasil. It's recommended for now, I think, everybody. One of the best vaccines developed in the history of medicine. First, it's basically a bunch of viral proteins artificially produced. It's called recombinant vaccine. Does that make sense? So virus is not even closed during the production. It's, along with hepatitis B vaccine, one of the safest vaccines that we ever made. Like, extremely safe. The downside is a little bit on the expensive side. Very, very safe. And what's amazing is that vaccination with Gardasil creates much better immune response and immune protection than the natural infection. Okay, so it is recommended for teenagers who did not start sexual life yet, but recently it was recommended for adults as well because it reduces the risk of cervical cancer. In vaccinated people, it pretty much eliminates it. Okay, and by the way, like just an illustration, both of my boys are vaccinated against papillomavirus because, you know, it's covered, safe, no side effects. Why not? Okay, that makes sense? Questions about the viruses? Well, we'll talk more, obviously, about them.